This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
The first paper we have is from David Howard. David is a lecturer in sustainable development at the University of Oxford. As I'm sure many of you know, he was formerly the chair of the Society of Caribbean Studies. His research focuses on urban geography of Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. David.
Thank you. Nearly had my Christmas photos up there, so you were spared that. It wasn't a great Christmas. Okay, so a pleasure to be here today. Many thanks to Kate and Peter for inviting me, for organising the day, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about current aspects of Jamaica, but also historical aspects of Jamaica. I'm an urban geographer, and I've done my research mainly in the Caribbean, focusing on the Dominican Republic and Jamaica, as Bill says. I've looked over particularly looked at census data and done interviews, really looking at the transition of Kingston as a capital city during colonial period, through independence and up to the present day. So today I'm really going to talk about some of that transition, but primarily about current neighbourhood development initiatives in downtown Kingston. And the core themes that I'm going to wade through probably are urbanisation. I'll be looking at ideas of security, particularly within the context of the Caribbean and Jamaica. Look at tenure, and I think Jean's talk was linked very neatly with the notion of the importance of land, but also Jean said a few times the importance of security. And you mentioned informal settlement. And in some ways I'm looking at that process whereby how does informal settlements become formalised, and whether that's actually a positive or a negative aspect. And so that notion of formalising tenure and security of tenure fits in very well. So thanks very much for providing this inspiration. I'll also be looking at in terms of social sustainability, looking at ideas of security and urban governance, and bringing it all together under the context of looking at sovereignty, but forms of hybrid governance, particularly in downtown Kingston. So, the bigger picture is why does Kingston, Jamaica matter? Well, apart from the fact it's the capital of Jamaica, it also fits very much into contemporary concerns about future environmental change, climate change, but also about a future demographic situation of our global population. And so David Dodman is an expert on these matters, so I will quickly talk about this and leave David to explore greater precision and depth. But why do urban areas matter today? So why does urban Kingston matter today? Well, in 1950 there were around 86 cities with a population over 1 million people. UN Habitat and other researching institutions and agencies argue that increasingly, if we're going to look at environmental, social, economic, political issues, cities are at the forefront of our concerns, because the majority of the world's population is living in urban areas. The majority of the world's population are young, they're low income, and they're living in these urban areas. So the focus really for much strategy has migrated, if you will, to the urban context. By 2015, so very shortly, there'll be over 550 cities of over 1 million inhabitants. But crucially, the 2 points that really give focus to maybe what's happening in Kingston is that 2/3 of the world's population growth will be absorbed by urban areas, and 95% of that growth is going to be in the global south, particularly in the global urban south. So when we're looking at issues of sustainability, in a general perspective, many authors have said that cities really are the sites to initiate forms of sustainable living, sustainable livelihoods, and development policy. And again, with David's work primarily looks at, I'm sure we'll talk today, about the ideas of urban adaptation resilience, like the key of looking towards the 22nd century and beyond. What I'm interested in some of my research overall is looking at ideas of sustainable urban development, but to move away from the notion of it being something that matters just in the global south, and particularly look at ideas of sustainability as they occur in the global south, and look at the transfer of knowledge between sustainable practice in the south vis-a-vis sustainable transfer of knowledge across southern majority world countries and cities. So I won't linger on this slide too much, but when we talk about sustainable cities, we're often looking about the awareness of the urban impact upon the outer region. For any of you who have commuted in downtown Kingston or commuted in Kingston, the impact upon Kingston, the Kingston metropolitan region, upon surrounding areas is very intense, especially if you're in a car trying to travel from Spanish Town through to New Kingston. Accountability and responsibility for increasing consumption affect not only the richer, shall we say, populations of global north, they're important for all urban populations. Local Agenda 21, again, thinking globally, acting local, again, fits very much into really any urban context. And ideas of mixed land use and diversity, compacted development. Kingston, particularly downtown, has high levels of urban density. Whereas many years ago we saw that as signs of, shall we say, poverty or underdevelopment, or whatever you want to call it, increasingly high-density living is seen as the most efficient, most sustainable way of existing in the urban environment. Increasingly, we're looking at not so much not only what's built above the ground, but if we're looking at sustainable urban form, we're looking at what's below the ground. How we build beneath the surface, how we work through sewage systems, etc., where the water flows is as important as what happens above ground. So sustainable cities aren't just the visual above surface, but what happens down in the sewers, etc., and below, and how it impacts upon the hydrological cycle. Renewable energies, and really what I'm going to talk about today primarily really is the notion of sense of place or community, are increasingly seen as part of the social sustainability of urban livelihoods. So that's really the wider background, and really when we're looking at Kingston, particularly in Kingston as that transition from a colonial to post-colonial city, what I've been doing with Colin Clarke, and also more recently with Alejandro Navajas in Barcelona, is mapping some of the changes, particularly from census data, and see how the urban form of Kingston has been changing. So if we go to the Doobly and Sons, I'm sure everyone in this room has seen many of the lithographs and the artwork, the images that Doobly and Sons have produced, particularly around the turn of the century. What I'm interested in is how Kingston, and these are photos, or images, sorry, from 1915, 1920, how Kingston, downtown Kingston is Orange Street, and how King Street, how that early urban form, how that is transformed into contemporary urban conditions. So, particularly with Colin Clarke, who many of you will know as an urban geographer, who's written a lot on Kingston. We've looked at census material from 1940s through to 1991, and now I'm interested in looking at the 2001 and 2011 census to try and map how Kingston's changing. And this is just from earlier work, 1991 census, and you can see by looking at the variables, look at the questions of census data, you can start mapping, if you will, this is the socio-economic status, or a class map, if you will, of Kingston. So very briefly, you can see we have the wealthier, often people with higher formal education, often in the, so we say the higher ranked professional occupations. We tend to be living in uptown Kingston, and in the lower parts of Kingston, downtown Kingston, you increasingly have less formalised levels of education, should we say less top hierarchy occupations, at lower income, etc. So they're sort of very blunt, empirical maps, but they tell a story, probably a story that many of you in the room will recognise or experience as you've been living in Kingston or travelling around. What is also interesting in doing, what we do increasingly, is now not looking at sort of visual representations of where people live, type of households, but using the idea of cartograms. And as Danny Dorling, who's a geographer, says quite bluntly, they're a form of propaganda. They tell a story, and you can actually tell the type of story you want to in the way that you, should we say, manipulate or use those figures. So where's this map of? Well, it's a map of Kingston, but it also shows the type of house form and the quality of housing in the city as a whole. And what the format does, each of the shading and the area on the map represents, if you will, the volume of that type of housing of that particular section. So again, this story principally reflects the previous map, and it shows us that the majority, this first printout, which is relatively low housing quality, tends to be concentrated in downtown Kingston. So this is not something you can see when you walk around, when you visit downtown Kingston. But what we can do with cartograms and looking at the spread of census data, and one of the things that the Colonial Office left Kingston, Jamaica, was a set of census records that allow us to in great detail chart the transition of the urban landscape over the last now almost coming up to 80 odd years. And so that is an invaluable source of information for Jamaicans in seeing how the city around them has been transformed. So that's how Kingston's changed. Many of you will, the term crime or violence often resonates literally but also metaphorically around downtown Kingston. And one of the aspects of looking at development downtown Kingston is the high levels of urban violence. And we'll look at the second report that came out 2 days ago. A report has again shown that in Kingston, in Jamaica, the issues of youth crime and the issues of trying to govern, change parts of urban Kingston are very much absorbing a lot of the state, public and private energies today. But a report came out in 2007 by the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime that went to the front page, I think, of The Economist, and the news was that the Caribbean as a whole was a violent place, an urbanised and violent place. So this made news, and in some ways it was helped to transform that image of, we talked about branding early on, but in many ways the Caribbean as a whole is an urbanised, it has high levels of urban crime, there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems there to work through. And this report by the World Bank and UN highlighted this, and in particular it came up with these rather startling figures, and I think these could be readjusted post-Iraq, etc., etc. But if we looked at the number of murders per thousand population, the Caribbean came out as being one of the most violent areas in the world. And again, you can play with statistics to tell a story, etc., etc. But nevertheless, these figures were a surprise to many, particularly to those who didn't know about or hadn't really understood what was happening in many of Caribbean's urban areas. And what the report said was that in terms of economic development in the Caribbean, it wasn't access to drinking water, it wasn't access to formal education, it wasn't many of the indicators of development which governments tend to focus on that was restricting, that was a roadblock to development. The report argued it was urban violence. It was the single most problematic issue facing Caribbean governments today. And it's probably interesting, however, in the recent Jamaican elections, where the rhetoric actually wasn't about urban violence, whereas the last election it really was, the problems of security, safety within Jamaican society. I mean, the debt issue and the economics were the main discourse, electoral discussion focus. But nevertheless, again, this is just general data taken from UN sources showing that in the top 10 states in the world where the murder rates were increasing or at a high level, I think out of those, Jamaica came in at number 3, but actually in those top 10, I think there were 7 of those countries are in the Caribbean or Latin American region. So that's a report of 2007. The report that came out on Wednesday by the UNDP, the Caribbean Human Development Report, and I know that Frederica from The Guardian is here in the room probably looking for a soundbite, so if you want to say something, say it to Frederica. But this report stated, again, these figures can be taken as speculative, but it was argued that over $500 million per year are spent on public and private initiatives to fight, which is probably a wrong word to use, or word to use, but to challenge youth crime. So over $500,000 per year of resources were going towards the issue of youth crime. It was estimated every year about $4.3 million in investment, US dollars in investment lost per year. And the other figure that came out of the report that annually Jamaica loses $95 million US per year by diverted tourism. So when people are sitting in Doncaster or Philadelphia thinking, where shall I go on my Caribbean holiday, and many times they don't click on the Visit Jamaica button. And overall, it's argued that youth crime costs the Jamaican state around 3.21% of its GDP per year. So these figures are are current and they're relevant. Whether they're accurate, there's an issue, but they're relevant for the contemporary debate of Jamaica today, and particularly for the next 50 years of independence. And trying to link these together, so why urban violence, neighbourhood development, where's the link here? Well, many of you will have known about Christopher Coke's final arrest in May 2010, but this made world news. And so I was living in Edinburgh at the time, in a geography department, where most of the geographers were interested in, volcanoes, thank you. Yeah, volcanoes and tweed making in the Alps Hebrides. But at coffee time, they'd be discussing the issue of Jamaica. And so this episode brought to world attention, a couple of years after the Economist front page, the fact that there were issues of urban violence in Jamaica that were being addressed or weren't being addressed. And clearly, I've put the word alleged links with political parties in terms of the transformation that was happening, but this brought downtown Kingston to the global stage. And it wasn't to do with Bob Marley, it wasn't to do with some of the classic branding of Jamaica, but it was an issue that made people in a cold coffee room in Edinburgh sit up and talk about what was happening. This stems from, I wasn't sure whether Amanda Size would mention this, because Amanda has worked extensively with Mark Figueroa, but this really lies at the root of the garrison communities. And I won't insult people today by trying to define garrison communities, but you can see that notion that downtown Jamaica, from work of Stone in the 70s and Figueroa recently, and others at the UE, is a real important aspect of understanding the urban and social patchwork of how Kingston as a city works and doesn't work at various parts of the year, or the various parts of the day. So when we look at neighbourhood development, how do we address that in the context of essentially, in many ways, zero tolerance policing, especially over the last year, the involvement of the JDF, the police force, the rather intense forms of policing in certain downtown communities. And also the question is, what happens now? There's a notion that the various dons are locked away in prison. Coke is in the States. But many of those jail sentences were for a year. So many of the lieutenants are coming back to various parts of Kingston and what happens next. And it's interesting, I think, in the contemporary debate, there are divided opinions about, well, actually, there's been a break. And I think when the Prime Minister at the time, during the Coke affair, said, this has gone enough. Actually, we need to break that link between formal and informal governance. Well, if not break the link, recognise that community leaders are running, in many cases, efficient community relationships, neighbourhoods, and how does the Kingston, the formal government, how does the formal state negotiate with these very powerful, influential local leaders? So in some ways, this is an interesting time to see how the sort of the post-Coke, the post-JDF, the intense policing of the last year or so, how that works out within the urban communities and the urban infrastructure, if you will, of downtown Kingston. Now, I won't linger on this, but this was just in 1 month, I think it was in March 2009, just going through the Gleaner, and all these images of people who have been involved, the victims, either direct or indirectly, of homicide in Kingston. But what then has been happening, and I'm sure you will all know, again, I'm sort of preaching, definitely preaching, but I'm talking to the converted, in that there's been a socialisation, a normalisation of what constitutes everyday violence in Kingston. So, over the last 10 years or so, I've just been collecting headlines, and it's very easy to collect these type of headlines and put them in a file, and it literally will be, okay, here's a statistical headline. And so it becomes number counting. Again, this is from 2005, and I've deliberately taken the few slides from over the last 10 years, just to see how it becomes socialised. You get normalised into saying, okay, oh, the figures, what's the figures this year or this month? Has it gone over 800? Has it gone over 1,000? Again, this was one of the stats, was one of the headline 4th of January, so within 48 hours 13 people had been murdered in, I think it was Jamaica overall, but the killings have spoiled efforts by the National Transformation Programme and the Peace Management Initiative to have a crime-free January. And so these type of headlines just feed into what becomes everyday discourse. And then then it feeds into the local economy. So this is a story outside the Kingston Public Hospital that funeral undertakers were offering, in terms of engendering their own market share, would offer certain gifts to go with a funeral. So if you had a funeral with so-and-so company, you would get baseball caps, or you'd get a certain extras in order to court the trade. And again, the last line of this, well, I'll read it out because I think it's one of those stories that just, again, it's journalism, and it's nothing more than journalism, but it's part of the mainstream everyday discourse that feeds into the way, I guess, Kingstonians confront violence, at least those who are reading the Gleaner. So death is a familiar face in Kingston and St Andrew, and it seems to have free rein, forever stalking the nation's capital. So it should come as no surprise that the business of taking care of the dead is thriving in the metropolis. It's a very competitive industry right now, so you have to make it attractive at affordable costs. And that was the case of funeral directors or those involved in funeral services, marketing at the A&E hospital. And this is a final, again, these newspaper reports and government statistics do come out, but what struck me here, this is over 10 years ago, is a separation between gunmen and civilians. But somehow there's a separate social category become gunmen or gunwomen. And somehow those who are, if you're a gun person doing a killing, you're not really part of civil society. And that really, I think, will feed into Amanda's notion of what constitutes citizenship rights, who is a Kingstonian, who's involved in some of the levels of violence, and some of the levels of anti-violence, some of the very important measures being taken, peace initiatives being taken, really all over Jamaica. So, having worked on empirical data and done some interviews over the last 10 years or so, many of you will be aware that Rosetown is now a focus of almost international attention, in that the Rosetown Federation has a programme of formalising tenure. The notion of, notion of urban redevelopment or urban development. Rosetown is one of the 4 sub-neighbourhoods of Trenchtown. So, for those of you who know it or don't know it, Rosetown is almost a microcosm of what has occurred in Jamaica in the last 3 decades. Upper Rosetown, top end is a PNP stronghold. South or bottom is Rosetown is JLP self-hold, and in the middle there's the area. You see that it's along. This is sort of Rosetown here. This is bottom Rosetown, and 7th Street, really through the 70s, was the major fault line between the PNP-controlled Arnott Gardens and the Trenchtown JLP. And that really, essentially, was, for all intents and purposes, a civil war zone. Now, how is that reflected in the urban landscape? Well, it meant that Rosetown is one of the only 2 constituencies that are split, have neighbourhoods that are split between JLP and PNP. So you see, on 7th Street, you have this, what's now known as no man's land. And bottom Rosetown became separated from top Rosetown due to the JLP-PNP alliances. So that's no man's land. That's this area just north of 7th Street. And that's Gordon's Grocery that essentially has been left as that no man's land became a centre for civil strife. But a legacy of that conflict really meant it became a no-go, not so much a no-go zone in the last few years, but definitely a territory that really wasn't part of the community. It wasn't JLP or PNP, but it was a no-man's land. So if we look at Rosetown Federation, what they're aiming to do is to bring the 2 communities together. Again, in some ways it's interesting, it's a microcosm of the political and social advice for much of urban Jamaica. The Formalisation tenure programme was started in 2009. It's recently had DFID and USAID and Princess Foundation funding and interest. And the process of formalisation is that if you, as a house, dweller can confirm you've had 12 years uninterrupted residency tenure, then for a process in the courts, you can claim formal tenure. And so far they've had 12 leases and a 60% success rate. It's a long process of trying to get that data there. And I just have 2 slides to kind of bring it together. And it's sort of, what I'm interested in is how the formalisation of tenure has now become an important part, or maybe it's always been an important part, of having security of tenure. That once you can prove that you own the land, then you're more likely to develop, to build, to consolidate on that land, but it also gives you access to a mortgage, to release capital with the bank, but it also gives you access to formalised services. So informality is in many ways in the 70s has been an important way of getting by, of being a resilient population, of being able to trade without having to face the problems of bureaucracy, to be able to create shelter without the restrictions of building guidelines. But increasingly, and the work by Hernando de Soto reflects this, there's an element of formalisation which is very good, in that if you're living in a market economy, you do need capital. And if you have built your own house, that in itself is your equity. And in order to release that equity, to develop further, the formalised tenure of your plot is an important goal to get. So that's an interesting element that's coming into, I'm sure, many of the work that David Dodman has been working on. But in Rosetown, particularly in the last 2 years, that notion of formalising tenure, securing your capital, but also allowing you to release that capital. So this fits into the wider aspects of rights to the city, as in some ways public-private access, but who owns the city, what is your rights as a citizen within the city, your rights to security of tenure. It looks at the notion of sovereignty. Sovereignty doesn't mean freedom to do whatever you want. It actually means having a certain form of regularisation. So obviously the notion of sovereignty says, well, actually, for the greater good, you take on certain regulations, restrictions, certain elements of formalised living to allow, to release other freedoms. We can look at, again, the Rosetown notion of hybrid governments. The interplay between formal government, but also local, informal, maybe extra-legal forms of neighbourhood organisation, and also locality. There are external factors. You know, where's the money coming from this? Well, it's US aid, it's DFID, but also the Princess Foundation. So we're talking about 50 years of independence, and there are issues there. The elephant in the room is, you know, what are these external factors, these funding sources doing within the locality of downtown Kingston? And I'll end it over there because I've overrun. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. We now move on to David Dodman, who is Senior Researcher in the Climate Change and Human Settlement Groups of the International Institute of Environmental Development and a teaching fellow at UCL, University College London. Yeah. I'm going to short the rest. Sure, that's okay. And let's just move on. You have such a good
I can't possibly live up to the promise. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and thank you, David, as well, for other forms of introduction. And the title of the presentation I'm going to give this afternoon varies just slightly from that advertised on the schedule. Putting it together, I realised that I very much needed just to focus on Jamaica rather than on the Caribbean as a whole, given the time and scope available. But there is a special prize for anyone who spots the one photograph which is not taken in Jamaica as part of the presentation. Thanks to the organising committee for asking me. It really has been fascinating to reflect on 50 years of Jamaica's development from the perspective of environmental resources, environmental impacts, and environmental management. And I'm delighted that the environment has appeared on this programme as a key issue, alongside the issues of politics, economics, and culture. Because I do believe quite strongly that the environment really is a key issue affecting Jamaican and Caribbean societies. And I hope that the inclusion of this as a topic here indicates or reflects a growing awareness, recognition of, and commitment to addressing the environmental concerns in the region. It's a topic as well that could be approached in a variety of different ways. I'm not going to attempt a comprehensive overview of the state of Jamaica's environment, nor am I going to attempt to give an overview of policy or institutions or legal frameworks for engaging with environmental concerns, although I'll obviously touch on some of those. What I'm going to try and do is pull together some of my own knowledge and interests that are based on a professional training as a geographer, some of my own professional history as a lecturer in geography at the UWI, and my more current engagement in global environmental issues, specifically climate change, vulnerability and adaptation in vulnerable countries. But perhaps most importantly, drawing on my position as an informed and concerned and hopefully conscientious citizen of Jamaica, in my own small way being part of out of many one people, a conscientious citizen who's fully aware both of the natural beauty and resources of Jamaica, land of wood and water, and also of the threats that are facing this beauty and these resources. So I'm really going to focus on 4 R's that do appear in the title. Resources. How is the environment seen and perceived by people in Jamaica and by the formal institutions of the state in Jamaica? How has this evolved over the 50 years since independence? Risks with an S, referring to threats to the natural environment, and risk without an S, referring to the threats from the natural environment, from disasters and from climate change. And then responses to the environmental challenge, the way in which policies and responses have evolved over the 50 years since independence, some of the current efforts to address environmental issues, and some of the challenges that remain. So I'm going to start with 3 quotes from different periods over the last 50 or so years, illustrating some of the ways in which Jamaica's environment has been presented or portrayed, and that indicate perhaps some of the different types of value that has been given to Jamaica's environment. So this is from a geographer's assessment of Caribbean views of Caribbean land, David Lowenthal, from 50 years ago on the eve of independence. He wrote, "The view that land is valueless, save as a commodity, persists in many aspects of West Indian life today. It affects agricultural development programs which exalt production but neglect stability of tenure. It is evident in the readiness of individuals and governments to sell and lease land to foreign corporations, and in the easy faith that the highest income per acre is the greatest national good." So a very instrumentalist approach to the natural environment, very depressing reading in many ways. It's negative about rural areas, and it's even more negative about the towns of the Caribbean. It's almost deterministic in some of the ways in which it identifies alienation from the land as being a root cause both for internal and international migration to the region. But even at this point, 50 years ago, the conclusion to the paper is that Caribbean land and Caribbean people do in fact belong to each other more than at any time for centuries past. So perhaps this is reflecting a state of affairs, but already beginning to look towards a slightly different state of affairs. The starkest contrast to this view, I think, comes from Mimi Scheller's work on consuming the Caribbean a few years ago, which really picks up on some of the issues of branding and the way in which the Caribbean and Jamaica are represented or understood or consumed by people outside of the region. The type of view that's very often emphasized by tourist brochures, the particular position that Jamaica and the Caribbean have in the imagination of people outside the region. The familiar sun, sea and sand imagery, and an ecotourism imagery of unspoiled primal rainforests, waterfalls and lush greenery, pick up on long-standing visual and literary themes in Western culture based on the idea of tropical islands as microcosms of earthly paradise. So again, a very strongly stated view, this one of Caribbean lands and Jamaica as an island as being some kind of earthly paradise. And a third view, this from Elizabeth Thomas Hope, who was a professor of environmental management at the UWI and the founder of the Environmental Management Unit. When you ask people in Jamaica about their environment, some immediately refer to the cutting down of trees, some to the problems of garbage and litter, some to the problems of drains and the unhealthy conditions of stagnant water, the problems of sanitation in the inner city, while others even refer to the issues of safety and respectability in their community, the problems of crime, stress and tension. All are correct in referring to their environment in these disparate ways, that the environment is not a single or simple element but a composite of nature, man-made structures and societal factors. So a much broader view, a much broader depiction of how people in the Caribbean and in Jamaica might perceive this broad category that we lump together as being the environment. Perhaps as well we can look at shifting views of the environment associated with shifting patterns of economic activities in Jamaica over the last 50 or even 100 years. So very clearly, as the initial focus on the environment is being about natural resources, resources for extraction from the land, agriculture, both plantation agriculture and subsistence agriculture, and perhaps best epitomised by bauxite, really natural resources, literal extraction of the natural environment for use of, for generating economic growth or economic development. I love this picture. This is in Schwarz mines in St. Anne, just to see the sheer scope of the 100-ton truck and the actual amount of Jamaica's earth that is being extracted in the process of bauxite mining. So perhaps a view of the environment as being about natural resources that are extracted, to over time more of a view of the environment as being a natural resource that has a value that can be used without necessarily being extracted, with tourism being the epitome of this, and perhaps ecotourism being its highest expression, where the environment is a resource which is something that clearly attracts people and can generate revenue by being conserved and looked after, is a much stronger focus. And I'd like to be optimistic and suggest that perhaps there's even a recognition now of the environment's intrinsic value, that the environment has a value that is separate and apart from what can be generated economically on the basis of it, and being something that is intrinsically worth protecting and looking after. So these are some children's books and music that have just been produced in the last couple of years. You can see that they're proudly labelled as being product of Jamaica. This is Shaggy Parrot and the Reggae Band, featuring the voice of international Grammy-winning artist Shaggy. I find it very amusing that Mr. Boombastic has become this environmentalist and philanthropist, but he really is, particularly his work at the Children's Hospital as well, he really has transformed his public persona. But perhaps some of these things indicating that even among the way in which the environment and environmental concerns are shared with children and young people, as seeing them as the environment as having an intrinsic value which is worthy of protection. So the next R is the risks facing the environment. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on any of these because each of these issues is a large and complex issue. But I think it is worth identifying some of the key sectors and some of the key threats to Jamaica's environment. So there are high rates of deforestation. Less than 6% of the natural forests on Jamaica remain undisturbed, although about 1/3 of that remaining forest is protected by law. The clearing of land and deforestation leading to watershed degradation, with the downstream effects of increased flooding, increased sedimentation. And so this is from the most recent State of the Environment report, indicating in red the watersheds that are defined as being severely degraded, and yellow as being degraded. So about half of the watersheds in Jamaica being identified as being either severely degraded or degraded, particularly in St Andrew, Portland and St Thomas, St Catherine, whereas as you move into Middlesex and Cornwall, perhaps less damage to the, Jamaica's watersheds. Water resource problems and the contamination of groundwater from agricultural runoff. Even more important in terms of the contamination of groundwater from human waste, contamination with coliform bacteria, which seems to be the most severe problem in relation to surface water. And the problems of coastal and marine resources, pollution of water courses from point source and non-point source solution, pollution coming from a wide range of different places, largely as a result of inadequate solid waste management. The destruction of wetlands, the destruction of coral reefs, and the threats that these destruction and this damage to coastal resources poses to livelihoods of various kinds, including fishing and tourism. A range of urban problems as well, air pollution, waste management, and the fact that many of Jamaica's urban centres are still facing some of the 19th century environmental health concerns to do with water and sanitation, whilst at the same time having to deal with 20th and 21st century environmental concerns associated with air pollution and high levels of consumption. This is in Majesty Pen near to Kingston Harbour, where you can see the gully is blocked up with waste both from industrial sources, from food processing plants just up the gully, as well as waste from households. So the wide variety of environmental health risks that are posed by different kinds of pollution. Risks posed by poor housing, by inadequate water and sanitation, and by air pollution. But we can also look at the risk that is posed by natural environmental processes on human society and on Jamaica's economic development. And I smile at Jean's reference around the before and after Gilberts Memories, because I do think that for many Jamaicans, their personal histories are punctuated by particular dates around disaster events. I mean, everyone learns in school about the 1692 and 1907 earthquakes, but I like to think that the September the 12th, 1988 was a very formative day in my subsequent career and work on environment and climate change issues. I have a very vivid memory of being a young boy and having the eye of the storm go right over the house and being right in the middle of something which was so utterly awe-inspiring and so utterly destructive. Or this is my mum and dad preparing, as they're supposed to, for Hurricane Gustav just a couple of years ago. And so many of these things around that punctuate people's popular imagination as a way of engaging with or being affected by environmental events. Of course, the great threat for the 21st century is going to be climate change. And there is some good news from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Not much, but some good news. There doesn't seem to be any confidence in long-term increases in tropical cyclone activity. The latest assessment is that there will not be more hurricanes, and the latest assessment is that the frequency of these and the overall increase in frequency of these is not going to happen as it was suspected it might. But there's still an expectation that the tropical cyclone maximum wind speed is going to increase, so the storms that do arise may still be stronger, and that the amount of rainfall associated with these storms will also be greater. So the frequency might not increase, but the severity of them does seem likely to increase. It's also the fact that the vulnerability, the overall patterns of vulnerability to climate change are going to evolve because of changing demographic and economic processes that place things of value and human settlements at greater risk of being damaged by the events that take place. And this preliminary conclusion from the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which will be published next year, is that there are these characteristics of small islands that do make them especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change, sea level rise, and other extreme weather, climate, and ocean-related events. So how has Jamaica responded to environmental challenges over the past 50 years? What has been done? I think the first level is that there's been a very coordinated and well-developed set of research and academic responses to understanding what these environmental challenges are and to creating a cadre of professionals who are able to address these. And the University of the West Indies has, of course, been at the forefront with people in the biology department and the geography department, SALICES, the Institute for Social and Economic Studies, the recent development of the Centre for Environmental Management under Professor Dale Webber. I've showed these books for two reasons. Firstly, because they're a very good indication of the kinds of research partnerships that have existed and developed over time internationally on some of these key environmental issues. These 4 volumes are all outputs of a series of British Caribbean geography seminars with a focus on environment, development, resources, sustainability, vulnerability issues over a period of 12 or 15 years. The second reason I show it is that it's very difficult to miss an opportunity to put a book with your own name on the cover up in front of an audience. But this concerted effort really has produced a skilled cadre of professionals. My work now is largely in Southern Africa and Southeast Asia, and it's true for me to say that there are a few places where I've worked outside of Europe and North America where there are better trained or more qualified professionals working on environmental issues than is the case in Jamaica and the Caribbean. And this has helped to strengthen a variety of institutions. The National Environment and Planning Agency, ODPEM, the Disaster Planning and Emergency Management. I'm delighted that in the recently elected government has created for the first time a ministry with explicit responsibility for climate change, the Ministry of Water, Land, Environment and Climate Change. The way in which these institutions in Jamaica have linked with and strengthened regional institutions forms a functional integration around the Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre, with 5 Cs, around SEDIMA, the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency based in Barbados, and the role that Jamaican institutions have played in training the leaders for many of these different institutions. There's also been the development and implementation of a range of policies. The outputs like this very detailed State of the Environment report from 2010, 182 pages of detailed information on the state of Jamaica's environment and the responses to environmental concerns. The role of civil society in partnering with the government in addressing environmental concerns, for example in the management of protected areas, where the Montego Bay Marine Park and the Blue and Jonker Mountains National Park are both co-managed by civil society organisations and institutions of the nation state. But of course, not everything is rosy. There's a range of ongoing environmental challenges. Staying on the topic of climate change, there are changing patterns of risk that are poorly understood and that will need to be effectively managed. There are key principles around adaptive management that involves learning and flexibility. Rigid responses, responding to things as a fixed state, is no longer going to be sufficient. It's going to be in the need for greater flexibility, learning, and the implementation of low regrets options to reduce risk from climate change. Of course, there are ongoing tensions between environment and economic growth, perhaps best encapsulated by tourist development and some of the tensions that have arisen over the development of large new hotels, such as at Pear Tree Bottom, over the last few years. Challenges related to making the environment a priority for the government. It's rarely seen as an immediate need. In a resource-constrained society, a resource-constrained political system, they're getting resources for addressing environmental concerns when there are so many other pressing concerns for health, education, basic services, economic development, continues to be a problem. Challenges of institutional abilities, challenges of resources available to institutions, challenges as well of getting the civil society groups that work on environmental issues into the mainstream. They remain marginalised for all sorts of social and political reasons, and which means that their concerns are often left out of consideration. So a review of this type I don't think really warrants much of a conclusion. All of their presentation, as it were, is a review and conclusion. But I think it's clear to say that there have been significant changes in the way in which the environment in Jamaica has been understood, appreciated, both by Jamaicans and people outside the country over the last 50 years, and that there have been substantial developments in terms of the policies and approaches and the responses that have been developed over that time as well. But looking towards the next 50 years, particularly the challenges of climate change and the changing risk context, particularly around the tensions between conservation and economic growth, and how Jamaica can achieve economic development at the same time as addressing some of these environmental concerns are going to remain very key issues for the next 50 years as well. Thank you.